The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. Mustafar. The planet that is not a planet so much as an open wound in the galaxy's skin. Lava rivers cut through black volcanic rock in every direction, slow and indifferent and ancient. Ash falls in curtains through air that tastes of sulfur and heat, each flake catching the orange glow before settling into the soot-gray crust that coats everything here. The landing platform, the railing, the hem of a white gown now ruined beyond saving. Padmé Amidala stands at the edge of that platform, and she is crying. She has been crying since before the ship landed, since Coruscant, since the moment she understood, bone deep, that the man she loved had not simply made a terrible choice, he had become one. "Anakin," she said. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. "You're breaking my heart." He didn't hear her. Not fully. Anakin Skywalker, 22 years old, yellow-eyed, the Temple's blood still metaphysically fresh on hands that had never once trembled in combat, stood with his gaze locked past her. Locked on the ramp of her ship. On the figure descending it. Obi-Wan Kenobi. Traveling cloak. Saber hilt in hand. Not yet ignited. The betrayal hit Anakin like a physical thing. It rewired his face. Every grief he had managed to weaponize over the past 24 hours, the grief of Padmé's imagined death, the grief of the Jedi's imagined treachery, all of it alchemized by Palpatine's patient hands into something hard and sharp and useful, collapsed back into grief's original shape. "Raw, useless, devastating you," he said. The word came out wrong. Too quiet. "You brought him here." "Ani, Liar," the word landed like a verdict. He stepped toward her. His hand rose. It rose the way it always had in sparring, in combat, in every elegant and terrible application of a gift he'd possessed since birth. Not with effort, not with rage, but with a kind of horrible ease. The Force answered him without hesitation. It always answered him without hesitation. That had always been the problem. Padmé's breath caught. 3 meters away, Obi-Wan's saber ignited with a hiss. And then, silence, not the silence of held breath or broken nerves. Something else. Something that had no name in any language, spoken on any world in the known galaxy. A silence that pressed inward from all directions simultaneously, as if the universe had missed a single heartbeat and nobody had told the rest of creation yet. Inside that silence, Anakin Skywalker heard his own voice. 45 years old. Rasping through a vocabulary that would never exist now. Saying words he had not yet lived long enough to say. "Father, please." Then the flood came. It did not arrive in sequence. Memory has no sequence when it comes all at once. It arrives the way lava does, filling every depression simultaneously, overwhelming every barrier, and he was drowning in it, in 23 years of a life he had not lived yet. The mask, the breathing, the hiss and hydraulic weight of a suit built for war and worn like a coffin. A son he had never held, a daughter he had never known existed, a pale throne room and his own lightning-charred hands, and a boy, Luke, his son, his Luke, saying please, Father, in the same tone Anakin had used with Qui-Gon when he was 9 years old and frightened. He saw Padmé's funeral. He saw her lying in state, dressed and arranged beautifully. And he was encased in armor standing in a corridor somewhere, receiving the report from a droid, and he had felt nothing, because there was nothing left inside him capable of feeling it, and that nothing had powered him for 2 entire decades. He saw himself dying. Floor of a shuttle bay, armor finally removed at his own request by hands that shook. His son's face, terrified and grieving, and his own face, old, ruined, unfamiliar, and he had said, "Tell your sister you were right about me," and he had meant it the way a man means his last true thing. And then, light. And then the drowning sensation inverted, not flood, but surfacing, tearing upward through fathoms of dark water toward air, toward this platform, toward this specific moment which was not yet sealed, which was still. His hand dropped. His knees hit ash. The impact sent a small gray cloud billowing around him, settling on the white gown in front of his face, and Padmé made a sound he had never heard from her. Not fear, not grief. Something that was not yet either of those things and not yet their opposite, something suspended in between. He pressed his forehead to her stomach, to the twins he could now feel, quietly in the Force, two small lights he had spent 2 decades not knowing existed, burning warm and steady underneath his wife's ribs. He was sobbing. He could feel it without any distance or detachment. The sound came from somewhere older than his 22-year-old chest could properly contain. Padm's hands moved. Slowly, uncertain, they found his shoulders, and she held him the way she might hold something she did not yet understand, but could not bring herself to release. Anakin, her voice had changed. The crack was still there. The fear had not left, but something else had entered it, something careful and cautious and not ready to be named yet. Anakin. What? I know. He could barely shape the words. I know. I know what I was doing. I know what I almost... He stopped. The sentence had nowhere to go that wasn't an abyss. I know. Behind him he heard boots on ash. Slow, deliberate. Stopping at a distance that was not safe, but was not yet a killing distance. Obi-Wan's voice, when it came, was even. Dangerously even. The voice of a man who had seen too many forms of manipulation to trust what his eyes were currently showing him. Step away from her, Anakin. He didn't move. Not to comply. Not to resist. He stayed exactly where he was, with his forehead still against Padm's robes, and his hands open on the ash beside her feet, the least threatening geometry his body knew how to make. I'm not going to hurt her. He set it into the fabric. Then he lifted his head and turned enough to find Obi-Wan's face. His eyes. He needed Obi-Wan to see his eyes. Look at me. Obi-Wan. Please look at me. He saw his master look. He saw the exact instant Obi-Wan registered the color, the blue, the specific shade of blue that had been absent for the better part of a day, and was now present again with a quality that was not quite the same as before. Older, more worn. Like a piece of cloth that has been through a fire and come out intact but permanently changed in texture. Obi-Wan did not lower his saber. He was not a fool, and he had not survived this long by lowering his saber at unexpected things. But something in his stance shifted. Microscopic, a degree less certainty in what he was looking at. Anakin reached to his belt. Slowly, 2 fingers, no more. He unclipped his lightsaber hilt and held it out to the side. And then he set it down on the ash, and slid it across the platform with a single push. It came to rest against the toe of Obi-Wan's boot. I yield, Master, Anakin said. The title came out of somewhere it had not lived for almost a full day. It came out without irony, without strategy, with nothing behind it but the exhausted precision of a man who meant exactly the words he was using, and no others. Please, just help me save her. The saber sat in the ash between them. Obi-Wan did not pick it up. He did not step forward. His own blade stayed lit, held low, the blue glow cutting a stripe across the gray ground. His face did the thing it did when he was computing, privately, rapidly, without showing the work. Padm's hand had found the back of Anakin's neck. She wasn't pulling him closer. She wasn't pushing him away. She was simply there as she had always simply been there, in every terrible moment this life had asked him to survive. The volcanic groaning of the planet continued beneath their feet. Distant and enormous, and entirely indifferent. Anakin looked up at his master. His brother, the man who had stood over his ruined body on a lava bank in a future that would not now occur, and said you were the chosen one with a voice that broke on every syllable. I died a monster, Obi-Wan, he said. His voice carried the weight of decades he had no business carrying in a 22-year-old throat. I won't do it again. Obi-Wan Kenobi had, in the course of a distinguished career, encountered many forms of deception. He had been lied to by separatist generals, by smugglers, by senators whose smiles cost more than starships. He had been deceived by people he loved. He had been deceived by himself on at least 3 occasions he could identify with clinical honesty. He was looking at Anakin Skywalker's face and trying to determine whether this was a fourth. The blue eyes held. They did not shift, did not calculate, did not do the subtle thing eyes do when a man is performing sincerity rather than possessing it. Obi-Wan had spent 13 years learning to read that face, and what he was reading now was not in any chapter of that education. The lightsaber sat in the ash between them. "How much time do we have?" he said. Anakin was already standing. The movement was different. That was the thing Obi-Wan could not stop registering. The way he rose from the ash, the way he oriented himself to the platform, to the ship, to the angle of the sky above the lava flats. Not the kinetic, forward-leaning urgency of the young man Obi-Wan had spent a decade flying beside. Something settled. Something that had already run every calculation and arrived at its conclusions before the conversation started. "Less than we want," Anakin said. "He's already in transit. I can feel the bond, our bond, his and mine. He expects to find a body in a suit." He looked at Obi-Wan with a directness that was almost uncomfortable. "He will not." Padmé had steadied herself against the railing, both hands, knuckles pale, the ruined gown trailing soot. Her face had moved through several expressions in the last 90 seconds and arrived at a controlled, watchful stillness that Obi-Wan recognized as her political face. The one she wore when she was absorbing information faster than she could process it and refusing to let anyone see the lag. "Can you walk?" Anakin asked her. The question was soft in a way that did not match the operational speed of everything else about him. "I can walk," she said. He moved to her left side anyway. Not carrying her. She had been clear, and he had heard it, but present. Close. A half step away if the ash shifted under her feet. Obi-Wan retrieved the lightsaber from the ground and held it out. Anakin looked at it for a moment. Then he took it and clipped it to his belt. And something in the gesture, the familiarity of it, the lack of any theatrical weight, unsettled Obi-Wan more than almost anything else so far. He followed them up the ramp. The ship groaned as the repulsor lift engaged, the landing struts pulling free of the platform with a sound like something reluctant. Through the forward viewport, Mustafar's surface rolled away beneath them, a geography of fire and black rock and ash plume, beautiful in the way disasters are beautiful when you are not standing inside them. Obi-Wan took the co-pilot seat. His hand rested on his saber hilt, not gripping. He was aware he was doing it. He left it. At the navigation console, Anakin's hands moved across the panel with a speed that was not reckless. Precise, every input deliberate, sequenced, the work of someone who knew exactly what each system would say before he asked it. He pulled a heading, checked a secondary screen, dismissed it, pulled another. "Polis Massa," he said. "You know about Polis Massa," Obi-Wan said. "I know about a great number of things I shouldn't." He didn't look up from the console. "That one I know because it's where you'd plan to take her regardless. The coordinates are already in the nav system. Your own contingency, Obi-Wan. You just hadn't activated it yet." A silence occupied the cockpit that was not comfortable and made no pretense of being. Padmé had lowered herself into the seat behind them. One hand rested on her abdomen, a gesture so habitual and unguarded that it was clearly not performed for anyone. Just the reflex of a mother who had been frightened and was now counting what still remained. "What happened to you?" she asked. The question was quiet, stripped of everything except the need to know. Anakin's hands paused on the console. A single beat, no longer. Then they resumed their work. "I fell," he said. "A long way down, over a long time. And then at the very end of it. Something." He stopped. "Chose again. The Force gave me back the moment before it was too late to matter. That's the honest version. The full version takes longer than we have right now. Then give me the rest of it later," Padmé said. Her voice did not shake. She had decided something, privately, while she processed what she'd seen on the platform, and that decision had apparently included choosing to extend the fraction of trust required to board this ship and not demand more answers than the situation could currently hold. Obi-Wan watched her and said nothing. The trust she was extending was either wisdom or love, and he had never, in all his years, been able to reliably separate those two things. The sensor panel chirped. Anakin's eyes moved to it first. 1 second ahead of Obi-Wan. Then 2. Then he was already adjusting their ascent angle before Obi-Wan had fully read the display. "Imperial shuttle," Obi-Wan said. "Entering the system." "I know. You knew before the sensor, yes, flat, unapologetic. The bond runs both directions until one of us severs it. He doesn't know I've changed. He thinks he's feeling his apprentice waiting on the platform. He pulled the hyperspace jump coordinates and locked them. The nav computer ran its calculation, amber light cycling on the console. He won't think that for much longer." The amber light held. Cycled, the shuttle's signature on the sensor panel resolved into a vector, steep descent, landing approach, moving fast for a man who expected a reunion that would end with a body being fitted for black armor. Obi-Wan calculated the window. It was close enough that he would not have described it with a word like comfortable. Anakin, 12 seconds. The amber light turned green. The stars outside the viewport did what they do, elongated, stretched from points to lines, the Mustafar system collapsing away behind them into the white tunnel of hyperspace. The structural groaning of the hull absorbed itself into the steady, enveloping hum of the drives. They were away. Obi-Wan released a breath he had been managing carefully for the last 4 minutes. In the seat behind him, Padmé closed her eyes. Anakin sat back from the console and looked at the hyperspace tunnel for a long moment. The white lines bending gently past the viewport, eternal and clean. The most peaceful thing the galaxy offered to people in a hurry. He looked at it with the particular quality of a man who had not expected to see it again. Any of it. The light, the speed, the sensation of moving away from something terrible towards something that might yet be saved. Obi-Wan studied his profile, the jaw, the line of his shoulders, the specific stillness that had replaced what used to be a permanent readiness to move, to react, to fill any available space with some form of controlled velocity. He looked older. There was no physical reason. The face was the same face, the age the same age, but the eyes had acquired a depth that had not been there yesterday. The kind of depth that accretes slowly, the way stone wears under water, given enough time and enough current. Obi-Wan didn't ask about it. Not yet. There were questions forming that would need proper time and proper space, and neither of those things existed in a cockpit with a sensor board still warm from an Imperial shuttle's approach vector. Far behind them, moving at a different velocity toward a different expectation, Sheev Palpatine's shuttle set down on the landing platform at Mustafar. The ramp extended. He descended it alone, no guards, no retinue. He had not anticipated needing them for this particular reunion. Ash shifted beneath the hem of his robes. The lava rivers moved in their channels with slow permanence on all sides. The heat was oppressive and honest. Mustafar had no interest in pretending to be anything other than what it was. The platform was empty. No armor. No suit. No apprentice waiting in the ruin of what he had been. Nothing but ash and the cooling impression of landing struts and the specific silence of a place that something important had just left. Palpatine stood at the center of it, his hands folded inside his sleeves, his face arranged into an expression that communicated nothing, because composure was not a habit for him but a tool, maintained not because the emotions beneath it were absent, but because they were not for the platform and the ash and the empty Mustafar sky. He looked at the space where his apprentice should have been. "Run then," he said quietly. No audience, no performance, just a man settling an account with reality and deciding how he intended to answer it. "I am patient." The wind moved the ash in small drifts across the platform. His eyes followed none of it. "I built an empire waiting for smaller men than you to break." He turned and walked back up the ramp. The shuttle lifted without theater, cleared the platform, rose into the orange sky, and disappeared. Polis Massa existed at the edge of what most star charts bothered to acknowledge. An asteroid field in a system that had no strategic value, no mineral wealth worth extracting at scale, no population to speak of beyond the Polis Masson researchers who had chosen this particular form of quiet, for reasons that were entirely their own. The facility itself was built into the rock, corridors of pale composite and recycled air, and the specific hum of life support systems working harder than the ambient temperature suggested they needed to. It smelled like filtered nothing, like air that had been cleaned of everything, including character. Anakin had never been so grateful for anything in his life. He stood in the corridor outside the medical bay and listened to the facility breathe around him and did not allow himself to think beyond the next 60 seconds. It was a discipline he had learned at 45 and was applying at 22, and it worked because it had to. Inside, the medical droids worked without commentary or hesitation. They were not capable of either. Obi-Wan stood a few meters down the corridor, still present, still not entirely decided about something. His arms were crossed and his eyes moved between the sealed door and Anakin with the regularity of a sensor sweep, not hostile, not warm, purely informational. Gathering data on a situation his training had not previously categorized. Anakin didn't blame him. He wouldn't have trusted himself either. The door opened. The droid that emerged was a 21B model, its vocoder calibrated to the measured, uninflected register that medical facilities preferred. The voice of information delivered without weight, because weight was the organic mind's contribution, not the machine's. The senator's condition is stable, it said. Vitals are within optimal range. There is no evidence of tracheal trauma, no internal hemorrhaging, no oxygen deprivation markers in the preliminary scan. A brief pause that was processing, not hesitation. I will note that her earlier presentation upon arrival suggested acute physiological distress inconsistent with her current readings. Whatever she experienced, she appears to have resolved it. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin. Anakin said nothing. The knot behind his sternum, the one that had been there since the platform, since his hand rose and the 23 years came flooding in, loosened a fraction. One fraction. He allowed it. The birth is imminent, the droid continued. You may wait here. It went back inside. The first cry came 40 minutes later. It came through the door and through the corridor and through every careful discipline Anakin had assembled in the preceding hour, and dismantled all of it completely. He pressed the heel of his hand against the wall and stood very still. Then the second cry. Higher, more immediate, more certain of itself, even at seconds old. The door opened again, and the droid said, "You may come in," and Anakin moved before the sentence was finished. The room was pale and clean and overlit in the way medical spaces always were, as though sufficient illumination could substitute for the warmth that the materials and the ventilation conspired to remove. Padmé was propped against the elevated head of the bed, her hair loose, her face carrying the particular exhausted clarity that exists only on the far side of something enormous. She was holding one of them, a bundle of white cloth, and inside the cloth a face, eyes closed, mouth working silently, the face of someone who had arrived somewhere entirely new and was beginning the lifelong project of deciding what to do about it. Anakin stood in the doorway. He had held Luke once, in the original accounting of his life. Once, briefly, in the Emperor's throne room on the Death Star, a grown man by then, trying to save him, trying to be saved. And Anakin had registered through everything the suit filtered away that this was his son and he was dying, and it was too late for most things. That was the extent of his fatherhood in the first version of this life. A single exchange on the floor of a room built for cruelty. He crossed the room, sat at the edge of the bed. Padmé shifted the bundle toward him without being asked, reading something in his face that settled the question for her. He took his son into his arms. His left hand, organic, warm, curved beneath the small weight with an instinct that had no training behind it. His right hand, the mechanical one, the prosthetic that had replaced what he'd lost on Geonosis, and that he had worn for 3 years now without ever fully forgetting it was there, settled alongside with a careful precision the organic hand did not require. 2 different kinds of holding, both entirely present. Luke, the name had not been decided yet. Officially, they had not spoken it. But it sat in him like a weight he had been carrying for 2 decades and had not realized the shape of until this moment. Luke opened his eyes, unfocused, dark, moving in the slow and wondering way of something that has not yet learned to distinguish between faces and light. He found Anakin's face anyway, or found the direction of it, and his mouth stopped its silent working and he was simply still. Anakin's throat closed entirely. He didn't try to speak. There was nothing that required speaking. He sat with his son in his arms in a clean medical room on an asteroid, at the edge of charted space, and he breathed. carefully and deliberately. The way a man breathes when he is trying to stay level inside something that has broken every measurement he possesses. "There's another one," Padmé said softly, a note of something private and wondering in her voice, as if she was still surprised by the mathematics of it. He looked up. One of the Polis Masan attendants was standing near the secondary bassinet, and inside it, quieter than the first, already quieter, already choosing quietness, was the second. Leia, that name too, he had not said aloud, would not say for some time, but he knew it the way he knew the other, and he looked at her through the transparent side of the bassinet, and she looked at nothing in particular, with her eyes already more focused than her brother's. Already, impossibly. At minutes old, already seeming to take the room's measure. He laughed. He had not expected to laugh. It arrived without announcement, brief and helpless, the kind of laugh that is adjacent to crying, and sometimes indistinguishable from it. Padmé watched him with an expression he felt rather than saw, because he wasn't ready to look at her directly yet. The weight of what she was feeling was something he could sense at the periphery of his awareness, the force carrying it, the bond between them older than the formal ceremony that had consecrated it, deeper than the argument that had nearly ended everything on a lava-lit platform 12 hours ago. He transferred Luke carefully to the attendant's care and stood, and crossed to the bassinet, and looked at his daughter. She had gone quiet again, watching things that weren't there yet, with the eyes of someone who intended to have opinions. "She's already furious about something," he said. Padmé made a sound from the bed. Not quite a laugh, the closest thing to one that exhaustion allowed. An hour later, the room held a different quality. Dimmer. The over-bright medical lighting dialed to something approaching bearable. Both twins in a shared bassinet position so Padmé could see them from the bed. Obi-Wan had come in briefly, stood at the edge of the room with an expression he wasn't monitoring as carefully as he usually did, and then found a chair in the corner and stayed. Nobody spoke for a while. The facility breathed. The bassinet was quiet. Anakin sat beside the bed with his elbows on his knees and looked at the middle distance, and let the reality of the last 12 hours settle onto him like the ash had settled on the platform, slowly, completely, in every crease and hollow. "You said later," Padmé said. He looked at her. On the ship. Her eyes were steady, still tired, still entirely herself. "You said the full version takes longer than we had. We have time now." He was quiet for a moment. "It isn't a short account," he said. "I know. Some of it is," he stopped. Chose the honest word. "Some of it is very bad, Padmé. I know that too." She reached across the narrow space between them. Her hand found his, and held it with a grip that was firmer than her voice suggested her energy could spare. "Tell me anyway." He looked at their hands. At the hands of his children, small and curled, just visible above the bassinet's edge. At the face of his master, asleep in the corner with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to rest wherever the mission allowed. He looked back at Padmé. And he began. Yoda arrived the way he always arrived. Without announcement, without theater, and slightly ahead of when you expected him. The facility's main docking bay registered the shuttle's landing, and by the time Obi-Wan reached the corridor to meet it, the door was already open, and Yoda was already inside, moving on his Geimer stick with the unhurried velocity of something that had decided where it was going a long time ago. Bail Organa followed 2 steps behind, tall, composed, the expression of a man who had spent the last 18 hours making decisions in conditions that would have paralyzed someone with less practice. He and Obi-Wan exchanged the specific look of 2 people who have no good news to trade, but are glad to see each other regardless. "Senator Amidala," Bail said. It was both a question and a confirmation. "Stable, the children are born." Obi-Wan paused. Both of them. Bail's composure absorbed this and continued functioning. "Both," he repeated quietly. Something moved behind his eyes that he did not give a name to in public. Yoda had stopped walking. He stood in the center of the corridor with his eyes closed and his head slightly tilted, and the Geimer stick was still. And he was doing something that was not listening and was not looking, and had no word in basic that precisely captured it. The Force moved around him the way water moves around an object that has been in a river long enough to become part of the current. His eyes opened. He looked at Obi-Wan with an expression that Obi-Wan had learned across many years of study to take seriously. "Here," Yoda said. "He is here." It was not a question. "Yes," Obi-Wan said. The corridor held that answer for a moment. Yoda's gaze moved to the door of the medical bay and stayed there with an attention that was not hostile, and was not warm, and was not in any register Obi-Wan could easily name. Ancient. That was the closest approximation. The attention of nearly 9 centuries finding something it had not encountered before, and taking its full measure before deciding. "Bring him," Yoda said. "To the council room. If one exists here." "There's a briefing room," Obi-Wan said, 2 corridors down. "That will do." Anakin walked into the room knowing what it was. Not a debriefing. Not a conversation between people who needed information exchanged. A judgment. The word had a specific weight that he had not minded carrying since the moment he decided to yield on the platform. It was the correct weight for what he had done, and he had no interest in reducing it. He stood in the center of the room and did not choose a seat. Yoda was across from him. Bail Organa near the wall, present and quiet, the witness the situation required. Obi-Wan to Anakin's left, not beside him, not opposite, the position of someone who had not yet entirely determined which side of the room he belonged on. Anakin didn't hold that against him. The position was honest. Yoda looked at him for a long time without speaking. Anakin looked back. There was nothing he wanted to hide from those eyes, and hiding from them would have been an exercise in futility in any case. You did not conceal things from nearly 9 centuries of practice. You simply stood in front of it and let it see what it would find. Something moved in Yoda's expression. Microscopic, the small shift of someone who has reached out with their hand in a dark room expecting to find a familiar wall, and found instead an open window. "Tell me," Yoda said, "what you have done." Anakin drew a breath. Then he knelt. Not the quick tactical gesture from the platform. This was deliberate, considered, both knees on the composite floor, with the full weight of intention behind it. The same geometry as before, but different in what it carried. On Mustafar he had knelt from collapse. Here he knelt from choice. During Order 66, he said, "I led the 501st to the temple. I commanded them." He did not soften the language or select the words for the impression they would make. "I killed Jedi. Padawans. I killed children. Master Yoda. I know the number. I won't say it here because the room isn't large enough to hold it, but I know it." The ventilation system moved air through the room with quiet indifference. "I served Darth Sidious for 23 years in the life I lived before this one. I helped him build his empire. I hunted survivors. I enforced his will on 1,000 worlds." He looked at Yoda's face and held his voice level, because the only respect he could offer the weight of what he was saying was to say it clearly. "I am asking you to judge me. Not to forgive me. I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I am asking for judgment, whatever form you believe is appropriate. I'll take it." Silence. Then Yoda moved. He came around the table with the measured pace of his Geimer stick, and stopped 2 meters from Anakin, and looked down at him with eyes that held something vast and unhurried. "Close your eyes," he said. Anakin closed them. What happened next had no physical component. Nothing touched him. No sound changed in the room. No temperature shifted. No light moved behind his eyelids. But the Force that he had lived inside his entire life the way a fish lives inside water, barely noticing the medium, gathered itself around him in a way it never had before. Attentive, deliberate, Yoda, reaching out along its currents with the full authority of nearly 9 centuries, and finding what was there to find. The light that had returned. Not the performance of it, not the intention to return to it, but the actual substance, deep, integrated, real in the way that only things are real when they have been paid for completely. Anakin felt the assessment and did not resist it, and did not assist it. He simply remained present for it, The way you remain present for a tide. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It felt longer. He opened his eyes when Yoda's presence withdrew, and found the ancient master looking at him with an expression that had settled into something new. Not absolution. Not warmth, exactly. Something that Anakin, searching his vocabulary, could only describe as the look of a very old surgeon who has examined a wound and determined that it has, against all probability, already healed itself correctly. Impossible, Yoda said, the depth of what you carry is. A living Jedi, felt I have never, in all my years. He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He closed his eyes briefly, and when they opened again the expression had simplified into something more characteristic. What the Force has done here, understand fully, I do not. What the Force has done here, question, I will not. He looked at Obi-Wan, then back at Anakin. Dead you cannot become, he said. Undo what was done, your death cannot. The temple. The children. The Geimer stick shifted against the floor, a small sound in the quiet room. Their names live in the Force still. Your death adds nothing to that, returns nothing. Anakin said nothing. This was not a moment for argument or for gratitude. And he had enough experience with Yoda to know when the master was still speaking. Atone. Your life still can. Yoda's voice had dropped, the cadence of it carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. Waste it. The galaxy cannot afford. The briefing room held this for a moment. Then, Bail Organa said, carefully, there's a practical question about what comes next. There is, Anakin agreed. He rose from the floor. His knees were not young, but they still worked, and the action of standing felt different than it had on the platform, less like surfacing, more like simply being upright on ground he had some right to stand on. The Empire is consolidating. He'll use the Inquisitorius to search. He won't accept the Mustafar report. He'll know. How can you be certain? Bail asked. Because I helped build the Inquisitorius, Anakin said. The words were flat and factual, and he let them be both. I know exactly how it operates, what it searches for, what it ignores. He looked at Bail. And I know how to make us invisible to it. But we need to move quickly, and the children need to be kept together. Separating them isn't necessary. Not anymore. Bail absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things Anakin had, across 2 lifetimes, come to respect about him. I'll handle the political cover, Bail said. Communications, the Senate record, the official story. But I'll need your specifics on the Imperial registry systems. You'll have them. Obi-Wan had not spoken since the confession. He stood near the wall with his arms at his sides, and Anakin was aware of him the way you are aware of something you are not yet looking at directly, present in peripheral vision with its own specific gravity. He looked at him now. Obi-Wan met his eyes. There was a long moment in which neither of them said anything, and in that moment an accounting happened that had no language, that was conducted entirely in the medium of 2 men who had spent 13 years learning each other, and then spent a terrible day on a lava bank, and were now in an asteroid facility making their first halting attempts to find out what remained after the worst of it. Obi-Wan crossed the room. He stopped in front of Anakin and looked at him for one more moment, and then put a hand on his shoulder and left it there. We have work to do, Obi-Wan said. Anakin nodded. Yes, he said. We do. The falsification took 11 hours. Anakin worked at the terminal in the facility's secondary operations room with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 2 decades on the other side of this process, not cracking security systems, but designing them, approving them, sitting in briefing rooms while Imperial intelligence officers explained their architecture with the particular pride of people who did not know their supervisor had already identified every flaw before they finished speaking. He knew where the seams were. He had sewn most of them. The Naboo Civil Registry first. The ship. An H-type Nubian yacht. Registration NB 1399 Kresh. Needed to cease existing in a way that would satisfy a cursory search and survive a thorough one. He didn't delete it. Deletion left a scar that forensic systems were specifically trained to find, an absence shaped exactly like a record, which was almost worse than the record itself. Instead, he constructed a history. Volcanic debris impact during Mustafar's atmospheric instability in the hours following the battle. Cross-referenced against the actual geological event logs he pulled from the Mustafar Environmental Monitoring Network, still publicly accessible, nobody had thought to restrict them yet. The Empire was barely 2 days old, and had not yet developed its mature instinct for controlling ambient information. He filed the debris report, and time-stamped it 4 hours retroactively. Then he accessed the Naboo Port Authority system through a secondary channel, and logged a routine transponder loss consistent with the debris event. Then, the part that mattered most, the part that separated a good forgery from an invisible one, he filed an Imperial Intelligence preliminary inquiry into the loss, marked it investigated, attached a fabricated case number from a district that had been administratively reorganized in the chaos of the transition and whose records were currently inaccessible, and closed it. When an Inquisitor's search team eventually ran the registry, they would find a ship that had already been found, already been investigated, already been confirmed, destroyed. A closed case with a case number that would require 6 bureaucratic requests to verify, and would reveal nothing when they finally did. Bail Organa sat across the room with his own terminal and his own work, Senate Communications, the public record of Padmé's final days constructed with the care of a man who understood that the story told in official channels had a permanence that facts did not always share. He glanced at Anakin's screen periodically with an expression that balanced professional admiration against the discomfort of admiring something learned in service of things he did not want to think about directly. He was a diplomat. He managed the discomfort and continued working. The announcement, Bail said, without looking up. Senator Amidala. Cause of death. Complications of pregnancy, Anakin said. Keep it vague. Vague is survivable. The more specific the story, the more specifically it can be disproved. The children died with her. The words arrived and departed without Anakin allowing them any residence in his chest. The record shows twins, both lost. The pregnancy advanced enough to be known in the Senate, so erasing it entirely creates questions. Confirm it, confirm the loss, and close the thread. Bail was quiet for a moment. She won't be publicly mourned, he said. Not an objection. A fact being placed on the table between them so that both men could acknowledge its weight before moving past it. No, Anakin looked at the terminal. We can't be mourned. We can't be anything. That's what keeps the children alive. Another silence. A different kind. I'll handle Naboo, Bail said. The Queen. She'll need to know something. Not everything, but enough to keep the story consistent. She loved Padmé. Tell her as little as the story requires. The fewer people who carry the true version, the longer it stays true. Bail nodded once, and returned to his terminal. And the room held nothing but the sound of 2 men constructing a disappearance. 3 days later, the shuttle carrying what remained of their group cleared Polis Masa's dock and headed into the dark. Obi-Wan flew. Anakin sat in the cabin with Padmé, the twins arranged between them in the portable bassinet the facility's medical staff had provided without question and without apparent curiosity, because Polis Masans were, as a species, constitutionally disinclined to involve themselves in the business of their patients beyond the clinical boundary. The journey to the unknown regions took the better part of 2 standard days, with one hyperspace jump of the kind that required recalculating the route mid-transit, because the target coordinates sat at the edge of what the nav computer's charts acknowledged. Anakin handled the recalculation himself. He knew the coordinates the way he knew the other things he shouldn't. Carried them from the other life, from years of operational planning that had included mapping the regions the Empire's reach would not easily penetrate. The world had no name on any chart. He had no name for it either. It would acquire one, eventually, the way places do, from the people who live on them, from the specific vocabulary of a life built there. That would take time. They had time. That was the new reality. They had time. The speeder engine was not complicated. That was the point. Anakin had chosen it specifically for being uncomplicated. A single repulsor lift field generator with a motivator assembly that a child could learn without being overwhelmed, and Luke was not a child who tolerated being overwhelmed. He tolerated most other things with equanimity, but being overwhelmed made him frustrated, and frustration made him withdraw, and withdrawal was the one response Anakin had no patience for, because he recognized it too clearly from the inside. Luke was 5 years old and lying on his back under the speeder's chassis with a probe light in one hand, and an expression of deep personal grievance directed at the motivator. "It won't come loose," Luke said. "It will." Anakin crouched beside him, left side first, the housing threads counterclockwise on this model. A pause. The sound of small hands trying again. The specific quality of resistance giving way. "Oh," Luke said. "Counterclockwise on anything older than 15 years, Anakin said. "Someone decided to standardize and nobody told the previous decade's manufacturing." Luke emerged from under the chassis. His face was streaked with lubricant in a pattern that suggested the motivator had expressed an opinion about being removed. He held up the component with the satisfaction of something genuinely earned. Anakin took it from him and showed him the worn contact point. "See that? That's why it was stuttering. The connection was intermittent. Vibration shakes it loose over time." Luke examined it with the focused attention he brought to mechanical things, which was the same focused attention he brought to almost everything. Food, clouds, the behavior of the small creek that ran behind the tree line, the specific sounds different wind speeds made in the grass at night. He noticed things. He could not help noticing them. Anakin recognized this too. "Can we fix it? We can replace it." Fixing it would take longer than the part costs, and the fix would fail again in another season. He ruffled the boy's hair, which Luke tolerated without much enthusiasm. "Sometimes repair isn't the efficient answer. Obi-Wan says you always think in terms of efficiency." Obi-Wan says a great many things. From the house came the sound of a dispute, sharp, brief, and entirely one-sided in terms of volume. Leia's voice, 5 years old and already in possession of a rhetorical confidence that had not yet required any supporting evidence to sustain itself, explaining something to someone with the conviction of a senator making the decisive argument. The someone, based on the subsequent silence, had apparently conceded. Anakin and Luke both looked toward the house. "She wins most of them," Luke observed without apparent resentment. It was simply a data point. A feature of the environment, like the creek. "She does," Anakin agreed. From the window, Padmé's face appeared briefly, checking, finding them present and functional, disappearing again. The domestic calculus of a woman who had once managed a planet and now managed a household, and who applied to the latter the same organizational clarity she had brought to the former, with results that were, if anything, more immediately satisfying. She was thriving. He watched it happen every day, the specific quality of a person who has set down a weight they did not realize they were carrying until the absence of it changed the way they stood. The politics had been a calling, genuine and deep. But it had also been a war conducted without weapons, and even a senator who loved the work eventually needed to put the weapons down. She had put them down. She had taken up a life instead. Obi-Wan came around the side of the house with his arms full of cut timber, moving with the easy competence of a man who had, after initial philosophical resistance, made his peace with the practical requirements of a homestead. He had made similar peace with cooking, with maintaining the perimeter sensors he'd installed in the tree line, and with the inexplicable habit Luke had of materializing at his elbow whenever he sat down to read. He set the timber down near the fuel stack and looked at Anakin and Luke and the disassembled speeder. "Motivator?" he said. "Motivator," Anakin confirmed. Obi-Wan nodded as though this was the expected answer, and went back inside. That night, Anakin sat on the step outside the house after the children were asleep and watched the sky, which was different from any sky he had known before. The stars here had no names in his memory, no campaigns associated with them, no fleet engagements, no worlds whose surfaces he had visited in a black suit on missions he did not think about directly if he could help it. Clean stars. Unknown stars. He dreamed sometimes of the other life. Not often, less often than in the first months, when it had been almost nightly. But sometimes he would surface from sleep with the phantom weight of armor on his shoulders and the phantom sound of mechanical breathing and a panic that took several seconds to resolve against the evidence of his own hands, his own lungs. The warm pressure of Padmé sleeping beside him. He would lie still until the panic settled. Then he would listen to the house breathe around him, the twins in their room, Obi-Wan in his, the creak and settle of unfamiliar timber, and he would remind himself, with the same quiet deliberateness every time, that he had already lived the worst version of this story. He would not live it again. He looked at the clean, unnamed stars and let that conviction sit in him like ballast, not armor, not a wall, but weight in the keel. The thing that kept a vessel oriented when the current pushed, it held. The Imperial Palace had been the Republic's seat of executive power before Palpatine renamed it, and the renaming had taken less than a week. The structure itself was unchanged. The same corridors, the same chambers, the same geometry of power arranged to make visitors feel small before they reached the room where the important conversations happened. Only the insignia had changed, and the guards, and the quality of silence in the hallways, which had acquired a new texture. Fear was quieter than democracy. That had surprised some people. It had not surprised Palpatine. He stood at the viewport of his private office on the uppermost occupied floor and looked at the Coruscant cityscape extending to every horizon, and did not think about the view. The view was a tool. Like the office, like the silence, like the title he had constructed across 30 years of patient architecture. You did not admire your tools. You maintained them and used them when the task required. He was thinking about a landing platform on Mustafar. He had been thinking about it, with varying degrees of focus, for 5 years. Not obsessively. He was precise about this distinction in his own accounting. Obsession implied a failure of control, an emotional investment that had exceeded its useful boundary. What he practiced was something more disciplined. Sustained attention, the kind of attention a jeweler gives to a flaw in a stone that is otherwise flawless, not anxious, not urgent, simply consistent, present in the background of every other calculation. Darth Vader was alive. He was certain of this the way he was certain of things that existed at the edge of his perception, where the Force moved in patterns too subtle for confidence, but too consistent for dismissal. Not the blunt, unmistakable signal of a living Sith that had gone quiet on Mustafar, had gone quiet in a way that still, 5 years later, produced a response in him that he monitored carefully and did not name. But something, a thread, thin, altered, different in quality from anything he had felt from that particular presence before, which was, in its way, the most interesting thing. Not gone. Changed, he turned from the viewport. The Inquisitor waiting in the center of the room was designated the second sister, and she had been standing at precise attention for 11 minutes, with the stillness of someone who understood that the quality of one's waiting communicated information about one's character, and whose character she therefore preferred to communicate carefully. Your search parameters, Palpatine said, have been too broad. My lord. Her voice was even. We've covered every system within the projected escape range of the Mustafar incident. The Naboo registry confirms the vessel was lost in the volcanic debris event. The case file is closed, he said. Yes, I read the case file. He moved to his desk without haste and settled into the chair behind it with the ease of a man who had been settling into positions of authority for so long that the act had become indistinguishable from rest. It is a very thorough case file. The debris report correlates precisely with the atmospheric event logs. The transponder loss is consistent with the debris profile. The investigative procedure is documented correctly and completely. He folded his hands on the desk surface. It is the most convincing closed case I have encountered in 5 years of searching. The second sister was quiet for precisely the correct length of time. You believe it was fabricated. I believe, Palpatine said, with the gentle patience of someone correcting a student who has demonstrated potential but not yet mastery, that whoever constructed it knew exactly what our search systems would look for, which narrows the field of possible architects considerably. His eyes moved to the viewport and back. Find me the case number's origin. The district attribution. I want to know when that administrative district's records became inaccessible and whether the timing is coincidental. It won't be coincidental, she said. No, he agreed. It won't, but I want the documentation regardless. Certainty requires evidence, even when the conclusion is already clear. He looked at her steadily. There are also surviving Jedi still unaccounted for. The fugitive Kenobi. I want renewed attention on any signal, however indirect, of Force activity in the unknown regions. Prioritize sectors with limited hyperspace charting, places people go when they don't want to be on any chart. The unknown regions are vast, my lord. They are. He acknowledged this without changing expression. Begin at their edges and work inward. He is not the kind of man who hides in the center of a dark room. He finds the wall and puts his back against it. A pause. He learned that from me. The second sister bowed and moved toward the door. One more thing, Palpatine said. She stopped. When you find him, and you will find him, this is an acknowledgement of timeline rather than an expression of optimism. He is not to be engaged directly. The instruction arrived with the flat certainty of a fact rather than an order. Observe, report no action beyond triangulation of position. His voice lowered a register, which was the closest it came to emphasis without theatrical inflation. He is not what he was. What he is now, I have not yet determined. Until I have, he is to be considered as dangerous as Vader was, with different variables. And if he becomes aware of surveillance? Palpatine's expression did not change. Then your team's operational competence was insufficient, he said, and we will discuss that outcome separately. The second sister left. 3 months passed in the way months pass when something is being built that requires patience, incrementally, without visible evidence of progress. Each day identical to the last from the outside while the interior architecture assembled itself with quiet consistency. The Inquisitorius worked in pairs, because pairs were efficient and Palpatine had no interest in redundancy that didn't serve a function. They covered the unknown region's accessible edges in a pattern that Anakin, had he been watching, which he was not, would have recognized as methodical and competent and, given sufficient time, inevitable. The seventh brother found the thread on a resupply station at the edge of the Tingle Arm. It was not the family. He was thorough enough and experienced enough not to expect it to be the family on the first pull. The family would be 3 or 4 steps back from any thread that visible. Because whoever had built their disappearance had built it with layers, and the layers were designed to look like nothing in particular until you found the seam. The seam was a resupply request. Routine on its surface. A small order of hydroponic fertilizer components, and a medical supply package drawn from an independent logistics hub that served several legitimate agricultural operations in the sector. Filed under a company name that checked out against standard registry. Existing for 6 years. Tax filings consistent. Nothing remarkable. The kind of account that the automated screening systems passed without flagging because automated screening systems were designed to find things that looked wrong. And this looked right. The seventh brother filed a physical cross-check request rather than a digital one. Physical cross-checks took longer. They required a living agent to visit the logistics hub and ask questions in person, which introduced delay and the possibility of human error, but also bypassed whatever countermeasures someone clever might have installed in the digital monitoring layer. He had a suspicion, refined across 3 years of hunting survivors, that the most dangerous people left in the galaxy were the ones who had anticipated the digital layer and were counting on searchers to stop there. He did not stop there. The hub's manifest coordinator, when presented with his credentials, produced the physical delivery logs without hesitation, because hesitation itself was a data point he was trained to notice and act on, and she had been sufficiently briefed to cooperate fully with Imperial intelligence. The log showed a delivery route that terminated at coordinates consistent with an unnamed agricultural area in an unremarkable sector of the unknown region's outer fringe. Not a confirmation. A direction. He transmitted the sector coordinates to the second sister with a note flagging confidence level as preliminary, significant enough to warrant follow-up, insufficient to warrant direct action. He had read the standing orders carefully. The standing orders were specific. The second sister received the transmission and read it twice, then sat with it for the length of time required to determine whether it met the threshold for escalation. It met the threshold. She prepared a report for the Emperor. In the throne room above the city, Palpatine received it the way he received most good news, without visible reaction, without the kind of satisfaction that announced itself in posture or expression. Those responses were for smaller men who needed the win to feel like a win in real time. He had waited 5 years for a direction, and it had arrived, and that was simply the accounting becoming accurate. Nothing more. He set the report down. He looked at the city. "Bring him back to me," he said, "to the room, to the air, to the calculation that was already running behind his eyes. Whole, if you can manage it. A pause, precisely weighted. Broken, if you must. The city moved below him, as it always moved, indifferent and enormous, and alive with the purposes of people who did not know what was being decided above them. He was patient. He had always been patient. The afternoon had the quality of afternoons that would be remembered later, not because anything announced itself as significant while it was happening, but because of the specific texture of ordinary life at full saturation. The light through the tree line, the smell of something cooking, the sound of two 5-year-olds engaged in a disagreement about the rules of a game that one of them had invented, and the other was now unilaterally revising. Leia was winning the disagreement. She had constructed a 3-part argument while Luke was still identifying what the argument was about. Padmé sat on the low wooden step outside the kitchen door with a book open in her lap that she had not been reading for 20 minutes. She was watching her children instead, with the particular quality of attention that looked relaxed from the outside and was anything but the attention of someone who had trained herself, over 5 years of practiced peace, to hold the present moment carefully without squeezing it. Obi-Wan was somewhere in the tree line, running the perimeter check he ran every 3rd day, with the methodical consistency of a man who took seriously the distinction between probably safe and verified safe. He had never, in 5 years, found anything on the perimeter check. Today would be different. Anakin was at the workbench on the far side of the house, fitting a new contact plate into the speeder's repulsor lift housing, when he stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Every movement ceasing simultaneously, the way a machine stops when power is cut, rather than the way a person pauses when distracted. The probe tool stayed against the contact plate, and his hands stayed where they were, and his eyes went to a fixed point in the middle distance that had nothing to do with the workbench. The force was moving differently. Not an alarm, not a signal, nothing so defined as that. More the way water moves differently when something has entered it upstream. A change in pressure and current that propagated outward from a source that was still distant, but was not distant enough, and was not stationary. Multiple presences. Force trained. Deliberately suppressed, which was itself information. Untrained people didn't suppress their force presence, because untrained people didn't know they had one. Inquisitors, he set the probe tool down on the bench with a control that was the only violence he permitted himself in the next 3 seconds. The only concession to the thing that had moved in his chest at the recognition. Then he was moving around the side of the house, already calculating. Vectors, numbers, how much time between current position and arrival at the perimeter if they were on foot, less if they had scout skiffs, the geometry of the homestead relative to the tree line, the children's position, Padmé's position, where the shelter entrance was and how long it took to open. He had run these calculations before, not as a drill, as a discipline, the same discipline that had made him check the perimeter sensors twice when Obi-Wan installed them, that had made him establish the shelter in the first year rather than the second, that had made him refuse the comfortable conclusion that the forgery would hold forever. It had held 5 years. That was longer than he had privately guaranteed himself. He came around the corner and Padmé looked up from the book she wasn't reading and read his face instead, which took less than a second. She stood. "How long?" she said. "Minutes, maybe less." He was already moving past her to the children. "Get to the shelter. Don't come out until Obi-Wan or I open it. Both of you," she said. Not a question. A requirement. "Both of us," he said. He crossed the grass to where Luke and Leia had suspended their disagreement in the way children suspend disagreements when adults arrive moving with a specific kind of purpose. Luke's face had gone still and watchful. Leia's had gone sharp, the particular sharpness of someone who has assessed that something is wrong and is already deciding what to do about it. He crouched to their level. "There are people coming," he said. He had decided in the first year that he would not lie to them about danger. The galaxy was what it was, and children who understood the shape of a threat were harder to frighten than children who didn't. "You remember the shelter? Under the floor in the kitchen," Luke said. "Go with your mother. Now. Stay there until I come." Leia looked at him with 5 years' worth of accumulated observation in her eyes. "Are you going to fight them?" "Yes. She held his gaze for one moment with an expression that was not fear, and was not the absence of fear, but was something that would, in a different life lived differently, eventually become the face a general wore before a battle. The face that acknowledged the cost without flinching from the necessity. Then, she took her brother's hand, and they went inside. Anakin straightened, as Obi-Wan emerged from the tree line at a pace that communicated the same information his own face had carried 30 seconds ago. 3, Obi-Wan said, arriving at his side. I counted 3 on foot. There may be a skiff, I heard repulsor lifts, then silence, which means it's set down rather than departing. Pilot stays with the skiff, Anakin said. Standard Inquisitorious deployment for a soft approach. They want confirmation before they commit to a visible action. Which means they don't know exactly what they're walking into yet. That's our advantage. That's our only advantage. Both sabers came off their belts simultaneously. The ignition was simultaneous too. Blue, both of them, which still struck Anakin on some level he didn't examine closely as the most accurate single image of who he currently was. They stood side by side in front of the house and waited. The Inquisitors came out of the tree line without theater. 3 of them, as Obi-Wan had counted, red-bladed, double-bladed in the distinctive Inquisitorious configuration, the weapons already ignited. They wore the dark armor and the expressions of people who had been told their target was a single fugitive and his family, and had therefore allocated their operational confidence accordingly. The lead Inquisitor stopped at the tree line's edge. He looked at Anakin and Obi-Wan standing in front of the house with their sabers lit and their weight evenly distributed, and their faces arranged around a quality of calm that was, Anakin knew, already communicating something the Inquisitor's briefing had not prepared him for. Surrender, the lead Inquisitor said, is the only outcome that ends with your family's safety. Anakin looked at him across the grass. You're going to want to reconsider your parameters, he said, before this starts. Not for my sake. The Inquisitor moved first, which was the expected choice and the wrong one. He was fast, trained, disciplined, the product of a program that had taken Force-sensitive survivors and rebuilt them around aggression and technique. He crossed the grass with his double blades spinning in the lateral configuration designed to force a wide defensive response, to push a defender back and off their line. Anakin did not go back. He stepped inside the spin, inside the radius where the blade geometry became a liability instead of an asset, where the weapon's own momentum worked against its wielder. And his blade found the gap, and the engagement was over in 2 exchanges that contained no wasted motion and no rage and no performance whatsoever. Just the complete application of 30 years of accumulated knowledge to a problem that had a correct answer. The lead Inquisitor went down. The other 2 split, textbook response, separate the defender's attention. The second came at Anakin from the left. The third broke toward the house's flank, toward the entrance, toward the shelter door. Obi-Wan was already moving to intercept before Anakin had registered the split. He felt it through the Force between them. The old combat language, older than words, the shorthand of 2 people who had fought beside each other long enough that covering each other's lines had become something below conscious thought. Obi-Wan hit the third Inquisitor at full stride and drove him away from the house in a sequence of controlled aggression that Anakin tracked in his peripheral awareness and did not need to worry about. Obi-Wan would handle it. He always had. The second Inquisitor was skilled. More skilled than the first, patient, not committing, testing rather than pressing, looking for the pattern that would give her an entry. Her blade moved in probing configurations, each one a question looking for an answer that revealed a weakness. Anakin did not give her a weakness. He gave her patience instead, which was its own kind of answer, and watched her grow uncertain in the way that fast opponents grew uncertain when the person across from them was not responding to speed with speed, but was instead simply there, present at every vector she offered, not advancing, but not yielding, the absolute economy of someone who was not fighting to demonstrate anything. She made the same mistake the first one had, committed to a combination that required him to respond rather than absorb. He absorbed it. Then he moved, once, with the decision already made before she finished the combination. Her saber was on the grass. She stood disarmed. Her breathing was fast, and her expression had moved past its operational register into something raw, the specific look of someone who has just recalculated the nature of their situation. Leave, Anakin said. Take your partner. He didn't look away from her. Tell whoever sent you what you found here. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the edge of the tree line, collected the third Inquisitor who had been similarly disarmed by Obi-Wan and was managing his dignity with limited success, and they went into the trees. The repulsor lifts, invisible somewhere beyond the canopy, spun up and moved away. Silence came back to the homestead. Obi-Wan stood a few meters off, catching his breath in the measured way of someone whose breathing had never entirely lost its Jedi discipline even after 5 years of forestry. He looked at Anakin, then at the tree line where the Inquisitors had disappeared. "You let them go," he said. Not a criticism. An observation looking for its own meaning. "He needs to know we're here," Anakin said. "He already suspects it. The search didn't stop. We let them report back and he confirms what he suspected, and then he commits fully instead of searching. He looked at the house, at the door. I'd rather know exactly what's coming than keep waiting for it to find us." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment, working through the logic. "And if what's coming is worse than 3 Inquisitors?" "It will be." Anakin moved toward the kitchen door and reached for the handle. "That's the point." He opened the shelter. Luke and Leia were at the bottom of the steps, sitting close together in the way they sat when they were frightened and were not going to say so. Luke looked up first and found Anakin's face, and whatever he found there settled something in his posture. Leia looked up half a second later and found the same thing and arrived at the same conclusion through her own methodology. Anakin sat down on the top step. Let them come up to him. Luke made it to his shoulder in approximately 2 seconds. Leia followed, which she would later deny was following, at a pace that was measured but arrived at the same destination. He held them both, and said nothing. Above the tree line through the kitchen window, the afternoon light was already moving toward evening, golden and indifferent and entirely ordinary. Obi-Wan appeared in the doorway behind him, looked at the 3 of them, and looked away. "He'll come himself now," Obi-Wan said quietly, to himself as much as to Anakin, processing a conclusion he had reached independently and did not appear pleased to have confirmed. Then, after a moment with a different quality, today answered what Yoda sensed on Polis Massa. Anakin didn't look back. Did it need answering? He said. Obi-Wan considered this. "Not to me," he said. "Not anymore." The homestead felt different after the Inquisitors left. Not damaged. Nothing had been touched. The workbench still held the speeder components. The book was still on the step where Padmé had set it down. The kitchen held the smell of whatever had been cooking before the afternoon rearranged itself. The physical world had absorbed the event without visible mark. But a quality had changed. The way a room changes after a door has been left open long enough for the temperature to shift. Everything present. Nothing moved. The difference existing only in the air itself. Padmé felt it the moment she came up from the shelter. She stood in the kitchen and assessed the house and the yard visible through the window, and the 2 men standing in the yard, and the children at Anakin's side. And she ran the assessment quickly and completely before anyone spoke to her, because she had spent 5 years running assessments on things other people were still deciding how to feel about. Then she put water on for tea, because some responses to impossible situations were simply correct regardless of context. They talked after the children were asleep. The 4 of them, Anakin, Padmé, Obi-Wan, and the weight of what they all already knew, arranged around the kitchen table with the kind of quiet that exists when no one is avoiding the subject, and everyone is simply taking a moment to be certain of their own ground before they step onto someone else's. Obi-Wan spoke first. "They'll send more," he said. "More Inquisitors first, then something worse. He'll want confirmation before he commits his own presence. He's patient. But the patience has a limit. And we just found it." "We didn't find it," Anakin said. "I found it deliberately." He looked at the table. "I let them go deliberately." The room absorbed this. Padmé's cup touched the table. A small sound. Why, it was not phrased as a question because she already understood the shape of the answer. She was asking him to say it anyway, to put it where all of them could examine it. Because hiding forever was never actually survival, Anakin said. It was the same outcome drawn out longer. More time. Time I'm grateful for. Time I wouldn't trade. but the same destination eventually. He doesn't stop. He was never going to stop. He looked up. We know this world now. We know him. Running again means finding another world, building another 5 years, and waiting for the next set of Inquisitors on a different afternoon. And the next time the twins might be in the yard when they come, not in the shelter. Padmé was looking at him with the focused attention she gave to arguments she was engaging with fully rather than waiting out. So we ended at the source, she said. Yes, we go to Coruscant, Obi-Wan said. Not a question either. The table had reached its conclusion without requiring a vote. He'll expect it, Anakin said. Sending the Inquisitors back was a signal. I gave him one. He'll be watching for us to run, to hide, to go further in rather than turn and come toward him. He won't expect the alternative. A pause. He never thought I was capable of choosing the thing that scared me most. He thought fear was a tool he could always use. That was his entire theory of me. Was he wrong? Obi-Wan said. The question was mild. It was also genuine. For 23 years, no. Anakin looked at him steadily. I'm working on making the remaining time the counter-argument. Something moved in Obi-Wan's expression that resolved, slowly, into the thing it actually was. Not quite a smile. The shape of one. The specific facial economy of a man who had loved someone for a very long time and had been given, unexpectedly, a reason to remember why. Padmé set her cup down and folded her hands on the table. I need to say something, she said. The room gave her the space without prompting. I've run the logic. I understand the logic, I've understood it since the Inquisitors left, and I've been running it since then, and it holds. It's correct. Her voice was even, and her eyes were on Anakin, and she did not look away. I am also terrified, not of the plan. Of losing you again. She let that sit without softening it. Not to the dark side this time. To a mission. To him. And I need you to know that fear is present in me before I tell you that it doesn't change my answer. The kitchen was very quiet. I know the risk, she continued. I know the alternative is worse. I know that choosing not to do this is choosing something, not avoiding a choice. She held his gaze. I also know that I fell in love with you twice. Once when I didn't know what you'd become, and once when I did and you came back anyway. So I am not going to be the thing that stops you from finishing what you came back to do. Anakin reached across the table. His hand covered hers. He didn't have words for what was in his chest. He had learned, in 2 lifetimes, that some things were not improved by language, that the attempt to name them precisely sometimes reduced them to something smaller than the original. He held her hand instead, and let the silence carry it. Both of us come back, he said. That's the only condition I'm placing on this. I'll hold you to it, she said. Morning came with the particular clarity of days that intend to be significant. Anakin woke before the light, and lay still for a moment in the familiar dark of the room they had built in the 2nd year, listening to the house. Padmé's breathing beside him. The distant sound of Luke turning over in sleep. He slept restlessly, always had. Some dream architecture busy even when the rest of him was down. Leia slept like a verdict. Present and complete, and finished with the day. He rose without waking Padmé. He found Leia awake. She was sitting up in her bed in the gray pre-dawn, with her knees pulled up, and her expression arranged into the approximation of calm she had been practicing since she was 3. Which was to say it was convincing to most observers and not to him. He sat on the edge of the bed. You're going, she said. Yes, to finish it. Yes, she looked at him with 5 years of accumulated perception and the specific quality of someone who was already, at this age, beginning to understand that some information was more important to hold than to speak. Will you win? I'm going to try very hard. This did not satisfy her. Her expression said so. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't, but it's the honest answer and you've never wanted the other kind. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she moved, quick and decisive in the way she did everything, and put her arms around his neck and held on with a grip that had more strength in it than 5 years should have produced. The grip of someone who was not going to say she was frightened, and was saying it anyway through the only channel available. He held her back. His daughter. His fierce, precise, already formidable daughter, who would, in a different life on a different world, lead a rebellion with the same focused will she was currently applying to not letting her father see her cry. "I'll come back," he said into her hair. She released him with the abruptness of someone closing a door. Clean, complete, done, already recomposing. "You'd better," she said. He found Luke in the kitchen, which was less surprising. Luke gravitated toward the kitchen when he was processing things, always had. Something about the familiar smells and surfaces, the mechanical ordinariness of a room built entirely around the production of warmth. He was sitting at the table doing nothing, which for Luke was itself a significant activity. Anakin sat across from him. Luke looked at him with the open-faced attention he brought to things he hadn't categorized yet. "Leia says you're leaving. This morning. She's scared." "I know. She managed it well." Luke turned this over. "I'm scared too," he said, with the particular simplicity of someone who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by accurate reporting. "Is that okay?" "That's exactly right," Anakin said. "Being scared of the right things is how you know you understand the situation." Luke absorbed this and filed it. He would do something with it later. He always did something with things later, processing on a long cycle that eventually produced a clarity he had not rushed toward. "Are you scared?" Anakin thought about the honest answer. "Of losing what we've built here?" "Yes," he looked at his son, at the face that would carry something of him forward regardless of how today resolved, the face that in another life had said "Father, please" on the floor of a shuttle bay, and meant it as both a name and a request. "But I'm not scared of him anymore. And I used to be. For a very long time." He reached across and touched Luke's shoulder briefly, the way you touch something you are about to leave. "That's the difference 5 years makes." Luke nodded. He didn't let go of Anakin's hand when it started to withdraw. He held it for one more moment with the artless honesty of a child who has not learned to edit his own need. Then he let go. Obi-Wan was already in Jedi robes when Anakin came outside. Standing by the ship with the early light catching the tan fabric and his arms at his sides, and the look of someone who had made his peace with the day's requirements, while the day was still becoming itself. He looked like the man Anakin had known for 13 years in the first life, and had been given back, incrementally, across 5 years in this one. Anakin went inside and put his own robes on. The fabric settled onto his shoulders with a weight that was nothing like armor, lighter, and somehow, because it was lighter, harder to bear. He stood in the bedroom doorway. Padmé was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed, her hands in her lap. They had already said most of what needed saying at the kitchen table. This was the version without language, the version conducted entirely in the specific quality of a look between two people who know each other completely and have chosen each other anyway. She stood, crossed to him. She put one hand against his chest, over his heartbeat, and looked up at him. "Come back," she said. He covered her hand with his, felt his own heartbeat under both their hands. "I never left," he said quietly. "Not really, just lost my way for a while." She closed her eyes briefly. When they opened, they held something that was not peace exactly, but was peace's structural component, the thing underneath it that held when everything else moved. She stepped back. He went. The ship lifted from the clearing as the sun broke fully over the tree line, the homestead shrinking below. The workbench, the shelter door flush with the grass, the kitchen step, the tree line with its perimeter sensors that had finally found something. Padmé stood in the yard and watched it go. She did not look away until the sky was empty. Coruscant from orbit looked exactly as he remembered it. That was the thing about Coruscant, it absorbed everything. Republics, empires, wars, the deaths of institutions that had stood for millennia. The cityscape continued regardless, layer upon layer of constructed light extending to every horizon. The planet's original surface buried so deep beneath accumulated civilization that most of its current inhabitants had never seen actual ground. It was the galaxy's most complete argument that some things were simply too large to be changed by any individual event. Anakin had spent 23 years believing that about Palpatine too. He had been wrong about Coruscant. He intended to be wrong about Palpatine. They brought the ship down in the lower levels, level 1313, which had been dangerous territory under the Republic and had become something considerably darker under Imperial administration, which had discovered early that the most efficient way to manage a population that lived below the sight lines of governance was simply to stop managing it. Nobody monitored the landing pads down here. Nobody looked at transponders. The things that moved through level 1313 moved through it because they did not want to be seen, and the district had developed, over centuries, a professional discretion about that. Anakin stepped off the ramp and felt the city close around him, heat from 1,000 industrial exhausts, noise that had no single source, and no silence between its layers. The smell of recycled air that had been breathed by too many people for too long. The force here was complex and dense, human urgency compressed into corridors that had not been designed for the population they now contained. He had missed it, in a way that surprised him. The complexity. The aliveness of a place that didn't care what you were. Patrol rotation, he said, moving toward the maintenance corridor that would connect to the lift shafts. Southwest quadrant of the palace changes at the 3rd hour. The sensor grid on the residential level has a processing lag, 47 seconds, because the central node was overloaded when they added the 3rd relay bank, and nobody went back to rebalance the distribution. Obi-Wan walked beside him, keeping pace, his hands loose at his sides. You're certain the lag is still 47 seconds. I certified the network architecture myself. In the other life. He glanced at Obi-Wan. I was thorough. You were always thorough. It was my primary virtue as a villain. Obi-Wan's expression did something brief and complicated. I'm going to choose not to respond to that. Wise, the maintenance corridor was low-ceilinged and poorly lit and smelled of old conduit and the specific industrial residue of systems that had been running without maintenance inspection for longer than their design specifications recommended. Their footsteps were quiet. Both of them had, independently and through different paths. Arrived at the same relationship with silence in hostile territory, it was not something imposed from outside but something generated from within. A quality of attention that reduced every unnecessary motion to nothing. They had moved like this before. Through separatist installations, through Dooku's war rooms, through 1,000 places that had wanted them dead. The old vocabulary came back without requiring retrieval. Security change in the East Corridor, Anakin said quietly, checking his internal clock against the movement he sensed ahead. 2 guards. They'll pass in 40 seconds. They stopped. Waited, 40 seconds. To the count. The guards passed. They continued. I spent 6 years planning the security architecture of this building, Anakin said. More to himself than to Obi-Wan. Every blind spot, every rotation, every sensor cluster with a processing weakness. He paused at a junction and chose left without hesitation. I designed it to keep people out. I didn't spend a great deal of time considering the vulnerability of someone who had designed it. Villains rarely plan for their own competence being used against them, Obi-Wan said. No, they plan for loyalty and fear, which are much less reliable. 3 levels up. A service elevator that the maintenance logs would show was last used 6 weeks ago for a ventilation inspection. The car rose in silence, cables and counterweights doing their patient mechanical work. He'll know we're here before we reach the throne room, Anakin said. The Force. Yes, we'll have minutes at most after he senses us. The royal guards will respond first. There are usually 8 on the throne room level, positioned in pairs at the 4 approaches. He looked at the elevator's rising indicator. They're not force-sensitive. But they're trained for exactly this kind of breach, and their weapons are rated to penetrate combat armor. So we move through them before they can coordinate. Quickly, Anakin agreed. And together. Don't let them separate us. He'll have told them that's their primary objective if someone ever got this far. Obi-Wan nodded. Calm. The specific calm of someone who has been afraid and has processed the fear into something useful and is now operating on the other side of it. The elevator stopped. The royal guards moved exactly as Anakin had predicted, which was the problem with training people to respond to anticipated threats. They became very good at responses and less capable of managing the moment when the anticipated threat arrived with someone who had written the response protocol. The first pair had 4 seconds between registering the presence and communicating it to the second pair. In those 4 seconds, Anakin and Obi-Wan crossed the corridor at a speed that the protocol had not accounted for, because the protocol had been written by a man who had not yet encountered what Anakin Skywalker moved like when he was not impeded by several tons of black armor. The engagement was brief and decisive, and conducted without lightsabers until the third pair, whose weapon configuration required it. 6 guards down inside 90 seconds, the remaining 2 at the far end of the corridor, who had not yet fully processed what they were watching. Obi-Wan looked at them. They looked at Obi-Wan. "I'd recommend standing aside," Obi-Wan said, with the courtesy of someone who meant it. They stood aside. The throne room doors were not locked. Palpatine had never locked the throne room doors. A man who relied on locks for security had already conceded something he could not afford to concede. The doors were simply large and heavy, and opened on perfectly balanced hinges because he had never tolerated anything in his immediate environment that was not perfectly maintained. Anakin pushed them open and walked through. Palpatine was standing. Not at the throne, at the viewport. Hands clasped behind his back. The full panorama of Coruscant's night-side cityscape spread behind him. The city's lights converting his silhouette into a shape that was mostly darkness with illumination at its edges. He did not turn when the doors opened. "I wondered," he said, "whether you'd come through the east approach or the west." "East," Anakin said. "Yes, the sensor lag. I've been meaning to have that corrected." A pause. "I never quite got around to it." He turned. The face was the same face it had always been. The ruins of the handsome man he had pretended to be for 30 years. The yellow eyes that had looked at Anakin across a decade of patient cultivation, and seen not a person, but an instrument. The face of someone who had decided, very early and very completely, that other people were a category of resource to be managed rather than a category of being to be acknowledged. Looking at it now, Anakin felt none of the things he had expected to feel. Not fear, not rage, not the gravitational pull of the old dynamic. That particular combination of deference and resentment and desperate need that Palpatine had cultivated in him so carefully and over so long. Those responses belonged to a version of him that had been built specifically to have them, and that version no longer existed. He felt clear. "You look different," Palpatine said. He was studying Anakin with the focused attention of a man running a diagnostic on a familiar system and finding unexpected readings. "I've been trying to determine, from the Inquisitor's reports, what the difference was. They couldn't describe it adequately." He tilted his head slightly. "Now I see it. You're not afraid." "No. You were always afraid. Even at your most powerful." He moved away from the viewport, not toward them. Laterally, the movement of someone maintaining positioning rather than advancing. "Fear was your foundation, Anakin. It was where you lived. I didn't create it. You brought it with you from a slave's hovel on Tatooine, fully formed, and I simply gave it a productive direction." His voice carried the inflection of a teacher reviewing foundational material with a student who has forgotten the basics. "Without fear, what exactly do you think you're standing on?" Anakin looked at him. "My wife," he said. "My children. My brother." He didn't gesture toward Obi-Wan. He didn't need to. Turns out that's more structural than terror. Something moved in Palpatine's expression. Not uncertainty, he was too composed for anything that direct. But a recalculation. A model being updated against evidence that the original model had not contained. "You'll fall again," he said. "Perhaps not today. Perhaps not to me." The yellow eyes moved to Obi-Wan briefly, then back. "But the pattern is in you. It was always in you. I didn't plant it. I merely harvested it." "You harvested it for 23 years, Anakin said. "And it still wasn't enough, in the end. You built an empire and trained an apprentice, and at the moment it should have been finished. Permanently finished. I chose my son instead." He took a single step forward. Not aggressive. Deliberate. You had everything. Every variable controlled. And it still wasn't enough. I want you to hold that thought while we do this. Palpatine's hands came out of their clasped position behind his back. "I have been patient with lesser disappointments than you," he said, and his voice had dropped into the register it used when the performance was over. The voice beneath the voices. Old and cold and entirely certain of itself. I have waited out longer games than this one. The lightning came without further announcement. Both hands, full capacity, the kind of force lightning that Palpatine deployed only when he had decided that restraint no longer served a purpose. It crossed the distance between them and the space between one breath and the next. Anakin raised his hand. The lightning hit his palm and stopped. Not deflected. Not redirected. Stopped. Held in his grip the way you hold a live wire. The energy contained within the geometry of his own force presence. Every arc and branch of it captured and held while his bones conducted the load, and his vision went white at the edges, and his teeth locked against each other, and he stood in it without moving. The way he could only do for Luke while dying, in the other life. For himself, now whole, Palpatine's expression completed its recalculation and arrived at something that was, for the first time in any interaction Anakin had ever had with him, the unmanaged version of what lay underneath all the management. The doors were already closed. The city blazed behind the viewport, indifferent and enormous. Anakin looked at Palpatine across the crackling contained light between them and said, with the quiet of someone who has already decided, and is simply now informing, "You took everything from me once." He held the lightning a moment longer, let him feel the weight of what was different, what had changed, what could not be harvested, or broken, or redirected. "Today, I take it all back." His saber ignited. Obi-Wan's ignited beside him. Palpatine reached into his robes. The throne room filled with light. Palpatine moved like what he was. Not the senator. Not the chancellor. Not any of the accumulated performances that had served him across 60 years of patient construction. Those were shed in the first exchange, the way a cloak is shed before a fight. Cleanly. Completely. Without hesitation. What remained was the Sith Master. 1,000 years of Bane's lineage distilled into one body, one will, one absolute commitment to the proposition that power was the only truth, and everything else was theater. He was the most dangerous thing Anakin had ever faced. He was also, for the first time, simply a man in a room. The first saber was Palpatine's own, the weapon he had carried concealed in the Chancellor's robes for 30 years. The blade he had used on the 4 Jedi Masters in his office a decade ago, in a fight that had lasted less than a minute. He ignited it, and came at Anakin with a speed that had no business existing in a body that appeared as ruined as his did. All of the physical decay a misdirection. A mask beneath the mask, the body still capable of everything the mind demanded of it. Anakin met the first combination with his blade, and felt the impact travel up his arm with the specific quality of engaging something that had been doing this for a very long time. He did not go back. The throne room was large enough for movement and constrained enough for consequence. The throne itself, the viewport, the approach corridors behind them, the geometry of a room built for a man who received supplicants rather than fought equals. Palpatine used the space with the intuition of someone who had stood in this room for years and knew every surface, every distance. The exact angle of light from the city below at any hour. So did Anakin. The difference was that Anakin had spent 23 years in a suit built for power and durability over speed, and was now fighting in his own body, his real body. The body that had trained under the best swordsman of a generation from the age of 9. The body that remembered everything Vader had learned, and had added to it the thing Vader had never possessed. He was not fighting angry. He was not fighting afraid. He was fighting with the complete and unhurried certainty of someone who had already paid every cost this fight could name, and had decided to pay it, and was now simply here, present, doing the work. Palpatine pressed, hard, relentless, the aggressive Form 7 that he had spent decades perfecting in secret, each combination designed to provoke an emotional response that would create an opening. He worked Anakin's right side. Then the low line. Then a feint to the throat, that was not a feint to the throat, but an invitation to overcommit to the block. The real attack coming from the lateral rotation he'd been setting up across 3 preceding moves. Anakin absorbed the invitation without accepting it. Then Obi-Wan moved. He came from Palpatine's left. Not the killing stroke, not the decisive engagement, but the disruption, the presence that required Palpatine to partition his attention at the exact moment his attention needed to be whole. It was a single move, efficient and precisely timed, the kind of assist that required knowing your partner's rhythm so completely that you moved on their behalf before they had finished asking. Palpatine's guard opened. A fraction. Half a second. Anakin took it. His blade found the hand, the right hand, the one that had aimed lightning at him for decades in one form or another, and the weapon fell. Palpatine moved inside the loss immediately, turning the disarmament into a repositioning, because he was incapable of being simply defeated by a single exchange. He threw everything he had left into the Force, a concussive wave that hit Anakin and Obi-Wan simultaneously, and drove them both back several steps, and bought himself the 2 seconds he needed to reach the secondary blade concealed in the throne's left armrest. His fingers closed around it. Anakin reached out with the Force and pulled it across the room before Palpatine's grip could complete. The weapon clattered against the far wall. Palpatine stood without a saber for the first time in a fight that had lasted 4 minutes and felt much longer, and the yellow eyes moved across the room with the rapid calculation of someone running out of variables and finding no results that served him. The lightning came again. Both hands, every reserve, the final committed expenditure of a man who had no remaining conservative options. It arced across the space between them with the sound of a storm in a closed room, every surface illuminated blue-white, the city behind the viewport briefly outshone. Anakin raised his hand. He had held lightning once before at the end of a ruined life, standing between his master and his son, drawing it into himself because the only thing he had left was the willingness to spend what remained. It had killed him. It had been enough. He held it now at the beginning of a life rebuilt, standing in the room where the worst thing in the galaxy had decided it was permanent, drawing it into himself because he had enough left and more. Because there was a homestead in the unknown regions with children in it, who were going to grow up knowing their father's face, and that was the only calculation that mattered. He held the lightning, and he held it, and he held it. And then, he released it. Not back at Palpatine, not the way the original accounting had ended, in a circle of violence that consumed its participants. He released it upward, through the viewport, into the city's indifferent sky, dispersed into the atmosphere of a world that had survived everything done in its name, and would survive this too. Palpatine felt the release. He felt what it meant. What Anakin saw in his face in that moment was not anger. It was not fear. It was something more fundamental than either. The expression of a man confronting the first thing in 60 years that his model of the universe had not predicted and could not contain. Obi-Wan moved. Clean, decisive. The blow of a man who had spent his adult life avoiding unnecessary harm and had identified this as the one harm that was necessary, the precise, committed application of everything Qui-Gon had taught him. Everything the Temple had taught him, everything 30 years of service to the light had been building toward. Darth Sidious fell. The throne room was quiet. The city blazed beyond the viewport, as it had blazed through everything, unconcerned with the specific event that had just concluded in the room above it. Anakin stood in the silence and let it settle onto him, and did not try to name what he felt because what he felt was too large and too various for any single name. He looked at Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan looked at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing wrong with the silence. The silence was the correct response to this particular moment, and they both knew it, and they stood inside it together for as long as it needed to last. Then Anakin crossed to the communications console beside the throne. He had spent 3 months before this moment identifying the specific files, not all of them, not the full operational archive of a 30-year conspiracy, but the precise selection that the Senate's record system would flag as requiring immediate address. The banking signatures. The evidence of manufactured conflict on both sides. Documentation of Palpatine's Sith philosophy committed to writing decades before, and never destroyed because he had never believed he could be found. The Order 66 command architecture, documented in his own hand. Anakin uploaded them to the Senate's emergency broadcast channel, flagged for simultaneous distribution to every member world's primary communications array, and transmitted. The Empire was not finished. An institution that large did not end in an evening. But its legitimacy, the foundational story it told about itself, the justification for everything it had done and built and demanded, had just been sent to every system in the galaxy in the Emperor's own words, and that was a different kind of ending. Slower, permanent, he stepped back from the console. "Time to go," Obi-Wan said. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.